Well, welcome everybody to the latest Redline podcast Twitter Spaces event. My name is Francis Leach. I'm your host for today's conversation, an important conversation about climate change, conflict, and food security, an issue that has become increasingly more important, at least more focused in recent times as a convergence of events such as the war in Ukraine and increasing incidents of climate change impacting have meant that food security, even for those of us in the most wealthy countries, has become a live political issue for the first time in our lives in many ways. But for people in other parts of the world, it has been a daily struggle for generations. So where does it all sit as we look at 2022? And what have we learnt from recent experiences about how to deal with the new challenges around food security, both in terms of supply lines, in terms of adapting to climate change and the challenges of food production, and the politics of food security and conflict. It's a really important conversation. I'm glad that we have some very fine people to join us in discussing this issue. Devry Vorwek, I hope I've said that right, but I'm probably not Devry, is joining us from Sustainable.
Just call me
I will
Devry.
call you Devry from Sustainable Strategies. She specialises in this particular issue. She's worked across the globe in this particular issue. Her company deals with reputation and brand and ESG and sustainability. And she joins us from Minnesota in the United States today to discuss this with us here on the Redline podcast. We're also joined by John Fowler, former Australian diplomat and founder of International Intrigue, an organisation that deals with geopolitics in a different way. John has also worked in China and other parts of East Asia as a diplomat dealing with food security issues. And Michael Hilliard, the host of the Redline podcast, is with us as well. And I must say, if you haven't already downloaded the latest episode of the Redline podcast, if you, like me, had a fascination with aircraft carriers as a child, this is for you, because the role of the aircraft carrier in the geostrategic position of the most prized ship in any fleet is changing dramatically. And Michael and his team have done a superb job in taking a deep dive into that on the latest podcast. So Deborah, I just want to start with you to define our terms. If we're talking about food security, what are we actually talking about? Can you define the term for us?
Yeah, and it's a good question because for those of us who have been working for years in this space, we'll get caught in the nuance of what is extreme hunger, what is food security, what is acute hunger, and at a high level, just to sort of level set with everyone, food security means that an individual does not have access to enough calories, and I don't mean just calories, but nutritious calories to regularly sustain their diet and their life. And so there are different stratifications of it. The UNFAO talks about the food insecure category all the way to chronic hunger and starvation. And I can go into numbers, etc. But essentially, it's everyone who is gone into the category of having to skip meals to those that are on what we call death's door, the brink of starvation.
So, prior to, say, the Ukraine war, most people living in Western countries wouldn't have thought twice about food security in terms of impacting their own lives. But for the first time in a long time, they are. And it's been a revelation to them that the food that arrives on their table every day is, in fact, vulnerable. And I just saw a report that was just released recently, which was fascinating, from an organisation from the Australian leaders in global security, talking about the fact that Australia, the country that I live in, only has 5 weeks of perishable food store in the event of our supply chains drying up. That we, even a country as rich and as wealthy and as sophisticated as Australia, doesn't have sustainable food security.
Okay, I hear you. So let me. So what you are talking about is the realization in the macro sense that the world now understands that. Okay, but I also want to say that food hunger and food insecurity are very local. So even in Australia, even in the Western countries here in the United States, etc., we have always faced pockets of food insecurity, hunger, even starvation, right? So I always say food security is very local. You can look around in your community and you will find somebody who is in need of help. What you're talking about is at the macro sense, there's a great awareness now of how interconnected our supply chain is. But also, if you back up, you quoted, we have 5 weeks, you start to begin you begin to feel a vulnerability. And that's where that awareness around food security as national security has come in. And then there are different stratifications of society. What has happened, and this predates what was going on with the Putin's invasion of a sovereign country, Ukraine, was that we were beginning to also feel it in our shopping bills for those who are considered, wealthy or middle class. And in the micro sense, if I could say, generally, in the Western world, let's say here in the United States, we would spend 10% of our overall income annually on food. Whereas in some countries, which we will get to, which is talking about those that are on death's door, many people, they would spend up to 80 to 90% of their income solely on food. So, if we want to kind of talk about it in that regard, we can. That in the macro sense, we have all begun to feel quite vulnerable, but we've always had the food insecurity around the world in our communities in the food insecurity in the micro sense.
Yeah, John, just what is the Ukraine experience exposed, and just how precarious food supply chains are?
Yeah, I mean it's a huge question, right? It's a complex question. I think you've got to be quite precise what you're talking about there. It's the supply chains are incredibly complex, hard to unpick, hard to stop. Very very sort of hard for any one actor to get a handle on. But I think what Ukraine has kind of shown is that when you have the result of 100 years or so of kind of a liberalizing free trade world, and the idea that you start to get countries with competitive advantages dominate certain production of certain crops or foodstuffs. And here I'm obviously talking about Ukraine's production of wheat. I can't remember where I read it, but it's a bunch of African countries have almost a total reliance on their wheat from Ukraine and Russia, which has been cut off. I'm sure there are stats that Devry or Michael might have on that. But the idea that there is an over-reliance on one geographical area for food supply that can go overnight, that can fall victim to war. But I think it's also important to remember that it's not just war. It could be climate change. It can be pandemic. It can be any of these not black swan events, because we know that they're out there, but events that are catastrophic and sort of one-off in nature can cripple the world's food supply, not necessarily because of the supply chains, but because of the place of production, the geopolitics, the geography of production.
So, Michael, it is that unhealthy sort of almost monoculture, isn't it, where countries produce an overabundance of a certain crop, which, when everything's working, seems fine in the international marketplace, but when it's not, it has enormous ramifications. Are there other crops or other staples as well that are in a similar situation to what we've seen with Ukraine and its wheat crop?
There are lots of crops and lots of different problems that are stemming from this particular issue, because they do cascade. So, for instance, right now, Russia is not exporting as much fertilizer as they were, which means that any country that is now low on fertilizer is having lower crop yields, which leads to just an increasing problem. We have countries like Kenya at the moment who were getting lots of grain and subsidy coming in, cheap grain coming in from Ukraine, who now are not getting that grain coming in as much as they would like. The prices have gone up. And that leads to the problem of their animals are now starving, because quite often that grain will be fed to their animals, which will then be either slaughtered for meat or will make more, or will be part of their production for the rest of it. And you've got to realize that a lot of these, particularly East African countries, keep a lot of their savings in livestock. It's really common, particularly in Kenya, Somalia, and the Horn of Africa. So if their grain stops coming, you might think, oh, it's just hunger. But no, it's also livestock for these families being wiped out, and that's their entire savings gone as well. And one of the major factors that we saw, particularly in Sri Lanka recently, was the fact that when they got rid of fertilizers and went to a very natural production of making crops, the crop yields went down by just over half, which caused the food crisis, which then caused going on for a whole bunch of extra reasons as well, but led directly to that sort of revolution. So the fact that we've had so many food crisis and we've had so much knock-on effects from this lack of grain is putting a lot of strain on some of these African countries, particularly your ones that were very dependent on the Ukrainian grain. That would be your Libyas, your Tunisias, your Egypts, your Kenyas. And that's having knock-on effects in not only their countries, but the regions and also further up the supply chain. And because, as you said, we're in a very globalized economy, countries like, for instance, Saudi Arabia, who outsource most of their food production to the Horn of Africa, are effectively watching these African people in the East of Africa make decisions to either meet their quotas and keep supplying the Saudis and keep those contracts, or feed their own livestock or feed their own people and lose that contract long term, which will have knock-on effects to Kenyan economy in particular going forward for the next 10 years. So it's a small problem that cascades into a medium problem that cascades into a big problem. And this is, what happens when it's a very interconnected supply chain. And welcome to the world of comparative advantage.
Yeah. Devry, can we zoom right in on that and give us a sense from your work about what happens in those communities when the rubber hits the road in a crisis like this, and the circumstances that Michael pointed out there, and sort of the decisions that people have to make in community around what they can and can't do. It gets really tough. What happens to the social cohesions in communities that face this particular crisis?
Sure. And I do also want to add my perspective on the supply chain. And you mentioned monoculture, et cetera. I want to back up and just level set that trade has been a good thing. 14%, and most food systems, as you said, in community are local. This is a statistic people don't necessarily realize if they don't focus on it, which is only 14% of the world's calories or food actually travels across borders. But it is that 14% that augments, the food system in many countries. And if some are over reliant, as we're talking about, on one particular actor, then there hasn't been a diversification of the risk of that food that needs to travel across borders. So I just wanted to make sure that we understood that generally it wasn't just because of a global monoculture society. What it is that trade is absolutely critical to some of these economies where the investment in the agriculture framework or situations like conflict have not allowed the investment or the private sector of what I heard was a comparative advantage to actually take hold. In these communities, I put myself in the mindset when all of this started to happen. And remember, this happened in 2008. So many of us came together very quickly because we'd learned a lot of lessons from the food price spikes in 2008 to what can we do now. We don't want to have to stumble over each other and try to figure this out. And so many of these countries that are net importing countries, I started to think about those, of course, like Yemen, who's 31% of their wheat supply, or Egypt, 85% of its grain, and 81% of it from Lebanon is coming from Ukraine. I mean, you start to think about what are these country leaders thinking about at the very basic sense. What do we do? And really, at the local level, there's a reprioritization of where are we going to spend our funds, and if we don't have them, then there's a massive outreach, and that's what's happening. Is that these leaders are without options at the moment, and having to look at the international financial institutions, the G7, the G20, et cetera, to say, what are we going to do to cover the cost of our import bill? Because we're having to import. It's fourfold. One, we've got to import food. Two, we have to import fertilizer. Three, we have to import fuel. And four, we have to have financing. So we call it sort of the 4Fs: food, fertilizer, fuel, and finance. And that's what's happening, is sort of an act of desperation at this point to figure out, first of all, the prioritization at the local level, the community level, is the food. Let's get the food in here, which is why you see David Beasley saying, look, we are now having to take food from hungry people and giving it to starving people. Mm-hmm. So the humanitarian response is what is first and foremost on the the front of the minds of these local leaders at the national and the local level. And then it's, oh my goodness, we have humanitarian issues, but now I've been working a lot with Earthring Cousin, former head of World Food Program, and she uses the word preemptive humanitarian. Now we have to figure out, look, we've got a disaster on our hands right now. We can't just think about the humanitarian disaster right now. We've got to think about 2, 3, 4 crop cycles. So the preemptive measures are, how are we going to get fertilizer in for the next crop? We need the fuel in to make sure that we can actually charge the next crop. And then the financing, and those are the three preemptive humanitarian measures that need to come into play very quickly.
John, what Devry's just outlined there seems to suggest also that the international rules-based order, which has facilitated, I guess, a global trading environment where the institutions facilitate the trade and the relationships between nations in order for trade to, for the most part, work, as it has done, must be under enormous pressure as self-interest and self-preservation starts to become a priority. Are we seeing that already as a consequence of the food insecurity that is starting to really take hold?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. I think to sort of follow on from what Devry was saying there, trade, the liberal order free trade has been a great thing for developing countries and being able to, comparative advantage in a perfect world is a great thing. I think the problem is that the last sort of let's call it 100 years of relative peace and stability and liberalized world order is, in my view, and I think a lot of people's view, is coming to an end, if not fully an end, an era of multipolar competition. And as Devry was saying, I think. Devry, correct me if I'm wrong, you said about 15% of food travels across borders now. I think I was reading something from the UN recently where it said that, within a couple of decades, that could be up as close to, 50% if climate change starts to affect a lot of the areas that are growing their own food now. And if you, let's just say that's the sort of extreme case. Let's say half of the world's food crosses a border by 2050. By 2050, you're going to have a world that is a lot less stable, a lot more multipolar, and a lot more susceptible to shocks. It's fine for countries like Australia, for the US, for France, for Canada, these kinds of places that can sort of create most of the food they need within their own borders. But what do countries like, Southeast Asian countries do, where their climates only allow them, very, very limited amounts of, base staple foods and ingredients. And I think you saw that with Indonesia recently. They sort of banned exports of, was it palm oil, I believe, or cooking oil recently, which then got Malaysia very upset because Malaysia relies on Indonesian cooking oil. So I think as you say, if the kind of global rules-based order starts to, and I don't like to be too dramatic about it because it's not going to fall over overnight, right? But it's going to come under more increased pressure from different areas, from Russia, from China, from potentially the BRICS countries in Latin America. You're going to start to see areas where people say, well, okay, if we can't rely on our, not even an adversary, a trading relationship that we currently have, if we can't rely on them not to cut off the whatever it is, the fertilizer, the energy, the oil, if we can't rely on them to sort of not do that when the shit hits the fan, excuse my language, then we need to start thinking about protecting our domestic food supply, our food security, and then you start to get protectionist policies. And again, I don't think like everything's going to come tumbling down overnight, but that world looks a lot different from the last 100 years in terms of goods flowing across borders and generally people. Food security is a huge problem, but things have been getting better for a long time, and perhaps they're not going to get better in the future.
Michael, are we already seeing countries making geopolitical and strategic decisions which are more informed by issues of food security and securing their own food security than they would have previously done?
Yeah, that is coming into play more, but obviously there are some countries who might not have that luxury to do. So someone like Saudi Arabia, which has no internal waterways, will find it very hard to do any farming, and countries like Japan, where real estate is very expensive, they would rather still get a lot of their stuff coming in for Australia because it's just it's cheaper to get it from Australia shipped right across the sea to Japan than it would be to try and build a big agricultural farming industry inside Japan. If we go down this road of really balkanizing our supply chains, which again does make it more secure, but if we take Japan and Australia as an example here, and Australia tries to make iron ore and beef and cars, and Japan tries to do the same, both are not going to do it at their capacity. Australia's not, hasn't got a massive automotive industry anymore. Japan's land is very expensive, so it's going to hurt everyone. And as Devry pointed out earlier on, trade has made everyone richer. We can compete, we can build and make more through comparative advantage. If Australia focuses on iron ore and farming, and Japan focuses on cars, we can make more of it and trade amongst each other. The trouble is with food supply chains is that we have globalized it so much that Kenya, as our example here, is effectively now in a position where even the meager amount of food they have is having to go off to Saudi Arabia and a few other Gulf countries to try and meet the contracts they've signed. And it's a real tough run, particularly for a government who's just coming into power now, to either decide to effectively cattle the trade deals they made and really put Kenya as an untrustworthy trade partner in the eyes of future people, or let people die and starve inside their own country. And it's a tough choice, and obviously the humanitarian answer is to feed the people at home. But yes, that solves the problem today, but it makes it worse for Kenya in 5 years. So I think there will be a slight balkanization of things, particularly when it comes to things like rare earths and microchips and whatnot. But then once this situation stabilizes, people are going to look and go, well, if it costs $10 to build a microchip here and $2 to build a microchip in Taiwan, I'm just going to go to Taiwan. I'm going to go back to Taiwan, and we'll get back in the same situation again the next time there's a big supply shock. So, we're trying to put short-term patches on very long-term problems, but the long-term problems either mean we need to scale back on the amount of stuff that we have available in the world thanks to comparative advantage, or we have to prepare that supply shocks will come, and they will really hurt every time they come like they are now.
Indeed they are. Devry, I guess the other sort of like as the rock drops in the pond and things ripple out from there is that population movements as a consequence of food insecurity will become bigger and more volatile and a lot harder to manage. Are we seeing that already in recent times?
Yeah, we're seeing that, and at the center of that is climate change, right? And so that is something that we can collectively own, because what all industry is doing to the planet is making it more difficult for us to produce food in places that would have naturally been the choice for us to produce food. So we're seeing, yes, we are and we will see massive migration because of climate change, because of our lack of water, etc. And I believe that what you're saying, John, is that we are moving into a very different world where you have these external shocks, these natural external shocks, but at the same time they're man-made. And I do want to back up, because I like to also be an optimist and bet on humanity and innovation to get ourselves out of this problem. And I do want to focus on, there have been many of us who have worked in the food system, who have understood how it operates. And a lot of people are waking up, becoming sort of these armchair food system experts, because it's all of a sudden a shock. But at the core of the food system, food has always been politicized. And what we are experiencing right now are very different political ideologies going on. And so the shock that we have to, acknowledge is that you've got a strong man who has completely shocked the system to make the world believe that the system is not or cannot be resilient. And I'm just not going to accept that, because I have seen that through lots of work, and it takes a lot of work to move food across borders and to ensure that, that people have peace and stability in their nations as a result of food supply. I would like us to acknowledge that what has happened is a massive political shock, And when you have political leaders who have no sense of conscience, that they're actually willing to starve others at the, so to make their point, then we're dealing with a very different system. I want to back up and talk about the Uruguay round agreement on agriculture in the WTO was the last global trade round that we have achieved. And as a result of countries coming together and working together and trying to hammer out all these political nuances that go on in each of their nations, we've been able to bring the system together. Now, if we accept that now we are having a massive geopolitical shift, and we are, and I believe, going to see blocks between sort of the Russia-China, ideology going into Africa, et cetera, and trying to carve up the geopolitics. If we accept that, then we know what we're dealing with. But we cannot give up on a global supply chain. What we can do, and I do not believe that we go spend our capital on building out redundancy because we're all afraid. Yes, national security, we do need to look at, okay, from a national security sense, do we have the right amount of stockpiles, et cetera? But if we do that as every country, then basically we are accepting the premise that we will divide geopolitically. So where we need to be spending our resources is not on redundancy, it's on resiliency. And in fact, the great race for capitalization should be in these very countries that are on the brink. I mean, we've mentioned Kenya all throughout Mozambique. We've got work to do in investments in South Africa, unlocking the northern grain belt of Africa. There's a lot of global attention that if we're not so focused on redundancy that we can very swiftly drive capital into these places, we can put ourselves on the path to resiliency. We still have to deal with the strongmen who want a different political order. But I do believe that the only way out of this is to continue to work across borders. Otherwise, we all suffer.
Devry's right, isn't she, Michael? Because Putin's whole gambit has been since about 2005 is to prove that the international rules-based order, as it stands, is done and dusted, and that it can't be trusted, and that everything is a lie, including the idea that we can have agreements which will provide food security. And that's exactly what the politics that we're seeing in play here. And is it not right to push back on that as hard as we can?
I mean, it's a bit of a double-edged sword for Putin. So obviously, yes, he'd like to show that the West is not nearly as strong. And obviously these countries that have, like Egypt is a good example here, who have been, slowly sort of creeping toward the West, are now thinking very, very primary thoughts. Let's get grain in here. Let's get oil in here. But Putin's also playing a bit of a delaying game here. Effectively, the first blitzkrieg of the war didn't work, and now we're looking at this real slow, grindy war coming up. And Putin knows that if he was to go to a peace deal right now, that he would probably not get as good a outcome as he would like. But he also knows that winter is coming and November is coming. The US midterms are coming, and effectively that will take a lot of the media away from Ukraine. But he also, speaking of food security, he knows that the Northern Hemisphere will stop producing as much grain come winter. So they'll be more desperate to make sure the grain input goes up, particularly gas prices as well, already at record highs. And this is usually the time of year when Europe has the cheapest gas. So we will hit a point at around in October, November, where the gas prices will get really, really high. And yes, whilst there is some unity throughout Europe at the moment around, the invasion of Ukraine, once it really hurts these developing nations as well as Europe, with the gas prices being so high and grain reaching a real shortage, Putin will start to put out that, look, we end this war today, and I turn the gas pipes back on, and we get the grain going again, and it kind of puts a lot of pressure on Ukraine, or a lot of countries will put pressure on Ukraine to take a deal no matter what, because it's hurting them domestically at home. Because if families are really, really starving and they've got an election coming up, and ads start coming out saying, look, end the war in Ukraine, gas goes down to the price that they were before the invasion, is a very tempting message for some people. So the whole food security problem right now, Putin's happy to let it sort of trickle out and put a Band-Aid on this, which calms down the situation and these sort of impending revolutions or riots we're about to see in particularly Tunisia and Egypt and Kenya. But he knows that winter is very quickly coming. The grain in the Northern Hemisphere will continue to fall, and that will drive up pressure on a lot of countries, both in grain and gas, to draw the war to an end, even if it's not the right thing to do. And I think this is just delaying tactics, hoping for a better negotiation position at the end of the year.
And John, as an extension of that in other parts of the world, and we saw this in Sri Lanka, where the insecurity caused by the disruption of supply chains there caused huge political instability, which has wider ramifications for the region. It's happening in Pakistan as well as we speak. What are the wider geopolitical consequences of food insecurity destabilising already regions that are very delicately balanced?
Yeah, I think Devry said it at the beginning of this chat, where she said it's, there's nothing more important, or very few things on even the same level as important as food for a population. So the more interruptions that to their food supply and again, it's important to remember that food isn't just the things you eat. It's the inputs to be able to grow the things you eat too. So it's fertilizer, energy, and as Devry said before, finance. So as those things become harder to get or more disrupted for places that are already particularly susceptible to political instability, and you mentioned two there, but there's Venezuela's particularly vulnerable in that sense, and a bunch of other countries besides. You're just going to see more and more instability. I think there was there's a pretty considerable argument that the rise of ISIS and these kinds of terrorist groups can be at least fairly loosely tracked to droughts. The idea that a lot of area where young men were working in agriculture and associated industries suddenly have their livelihoods ripped away. They go to the city, they become radicalized, and they become they sort of become terrorists, or they become politically radicalized, as you've seen in Pakistan or India, for example, where the farmers late last year sort of went on a huge protest for many months, shutting down roads and hurting the economy in that way. So I guess that there's no sort of good answer other than just saying things are going to be more unpredictable. But I also want to touch on what Devry said before, that while I think it's fairly inevitable that things are going to become more volatile, I haven't seen an argument that suggests that the world's going to become return back to the unipolar kind of global stability, largely rules-based order that we've had for the last 100 years. While that, I think that's true, the case for optimism is innovation, right? It's business, it's ingenuity of human beings. And I was listening to a podcast the other day where there was a Sierra Leone chap from Sierra Leone who has a company that is trying to make bread, which is a staple in Sierra Leone, trying to make bread out of 50% sweet potatoes. They've designed, or they've come up with a sweet potato that has vitamins and various things to help Sierra Leone's malnourished population. But the idea is to be able to replace at least some of the wheat that they import from places like Ukraine and Russia into a staple to make themselves a little bit more resilient, not necessarily building up stocks of redundancies of wheat in silos or anything like that, but just saying, hey, when the next time something happens to the wheat supply, we're going to be 50% more resilient because it's only 50% of the input that it used to be. And these kinds of things, if you aggregate them across the world, can really make a massive difference to food security. But they require, I think, people recognizing that there's a problem, that the world's getting more unpredictable, more volatile. Two, as Devry said again, which is financing these things. You need money to innovate. And three, everybody kind of understanding that the way forward is not to withdraw back into their shells, but to kind of think their way out of it, for want of a better phrase.
John,
Devry,
you hit on it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to continue that note of optimism, what are you seeing from your first-hand experience of that sort of that empowerment within communities, and also maybe technological advances which are providing some optimism that we can meet the challenges that our current circumstance poses in terms of climate change and conflict and being able to feed everybody?
Well, what I'm seeing is, so as an optimist, I'm also sort of pessimistic in the sense that it's gonna take a lot of work for this to happen. And I like to call this, we need fierce capitalization of what John's talking about. And unfortunately, because the food security issue has often been left to the food industry, like how are they going to solve it? there's not a grand awakening broadly across industry that they can be part of the solution. I just wrote a kind of an op-ed that said CEOs feed your people. My big, soapbox that I've been on is we need all industries at the table right now, innovating and collaborating in places like John just talked about. So from a community-based approach, I mean, actually one of our biggest strengths is that we have had globalization. And so we've got telecom, finance, we've got ag companies, we've got energy companies. We've, all of these companies are very present in a lot of these locations. And if they're not, they can bring in others. So we need fierce capitalization of those under sort of financed areas, like I mentioned before. Part of the reason is, look, I sat in the C-suite of one of the largest global food companies in the world. I could see, look, these companies have limited capital to invest. Are they going to invest it on their return on investment where they know there's more stability, or are they going to go to these places and spaces that are going to take a longer time to see a greater return on the investment? Some of these countries we're talking about, where we could really unlock their resources, their land resources, their water resources, their human capital. And so what I believe is that there's all this talk about capitalism is dead and et cetera. Well, actually, it's the only way we're going to actually survive is to capitalize the problem and get very focused on the innovation side of things. There's a lot of reason to be optimistic, even in net food importing countries that are dependent. We're seeing lots of results around vertical farming, for example. I mean, that has taken hold, or more sort of mobile farming units going into communities that serve that local need, that can actually up their domestic production to a point that maybe they're reducing their need for imported product. We'll never get away from the need for imported product. Why? Because we're trying to solve for the climate imperative at the same time. And the reason that we did diversify and produce in different places in North America, in Brazil, in Australia, John, et cetera, is because we are making best use of our land and our resources globally. So I get to this point of let's go for resiliency, not redundancy. Let's take a look and not accept Putin's premise, because we just need to be smarter. It's like, how are we going to outflank? We're going to step back and we're going to say, among sort of allied countries and others who know they're being put in a binary decision, situation. Do we choose that the world's falling apart, or do we reshape this order and maintain our trust-based, trade system? So the all roads lead to the underserved investment that has taken hold in Africa. And I don't know why, these companies aren't coming together very quickly and saying, look, we have UN Climate Week next week in Gabon. Why isn't the world of capital there saying, how do we help? Because we can't survive as a company in a world that is going the wrong way.
Michael, just to finish, do you share Devry's optimism and robust energy when it comes to making sure that that capital as well as governments redouble their efforts to meet the challenge of food insecurity?
Absolutely. I think Devry's hit the nail on the head, and so has John. Some of the World Bank programs have been really effective for being things like really small business loans to some of these African countries that have been very accessible to allow people to effectively get a hold of just enough money to plant just a home crop, or be able to buy a few cattle to start a very small farm or a micro business, which not only helps feed themselves and the people around them, but also brings stability. When we, for instance, were doing our piece on South Sudan a little while ago, speaking with locals on the ground, there was a lot of this, well, I don't like the militia, I don't believe what they stand for, but I also know that by being with them, I have food security. So if you have, crops in your very, very localized community, it stops people having to make that choice of, do I join a militia or do I eat? So I think Devry's hit the nail on the head that capital, investing in more resilient crops, less water intensive crops, better seeds, better engineering and R&D on those, as well as giving loans for a lot of these very, very small African countries and very small African communities to be able to import genuinely good seeds or even farm equipment. It's little things like, we don't think it's very much, but giving a tractor to some of these communities can make the difference between, can almost triple their output, because they can dig far better into the ground. They can do it far quicker. If they've only got a few people to be able to actually sow the ground, by having that tractor means they can go and do 3 times as much ground in one planting season. It's things like that that are really, really small investments that could be done and should be done. We just haven't rolled it out. I don't think there's been, because there hasn't been a financial incentive for the capital markets, because again, they don't make a lot of money, but they produce a lot of stability in the long run. So I think Devry, again, hit the nail on the head. Capital will probably be the solution to this problem, but we really need to get started on this right now. And with the G20 meeting in Indonesia and Bali coming up in the next couple of days, I really hope this is sort of top of the agenda for everyone.
Devry, Michael, John, thank you so much for being part of this discussion here at the Redline podcast and our Twitter Spaces event for tonight on climate change, conflict and food security. It's been fascinating. We've recorded this conversation, so we will retweet it and make it available to people who want to go back and have a listen again. And I really appreciate your time tonight, Devry.
Thank you.
This morning and where you are in Minnesota. John as well, thank you for being part of it.
Yeah, pleasure. It was a really good chat on a really important issue.
Thank you, John. And Michael, remind people where they can find the latest edition of the Redline podcast, which, as I said, as a kid that was obsessed with aircraft carriers, you sort of you're going after one of the my sacred cows here, but that's a really interesting listen.
Again, it's if I had said anything else, it'd be a very short episode. But we can usually you can find the Redline podcast at all the usual places, and your iTunes, Spotify, all the good stuff. But again, thanks to Devry and John for jumping on this one. I think it's a really, really important issue to be chatting about.
It is indeed, and we'll keep talking about it as things evolve. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming along. As I said, it will be available on at the Redline podcast Twitter account to listen back to, and please share it when you do find it again with those who will be interested in the topic. And I will say good night. My name is Francis Leach. I'll catch you on our next Twitter Spaces event, hopefully later in the week. More information to follow on that one. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.